John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading issue number 144, and just a little catch-up on what happened in the last issue. The last issue was interesting because it had two stories in it. It was called Telling Tales, and in both, John kind of went through different things. In the first story, John had a friend call him to her house where an old Japanese man had died, and it turned out that that man used to be part of Unit 731, which ran an infamous Japanese concentration camp in Manchuria, China during World War II. And because of all the horrible things that that man did in that unit, his ghost was stuck here. And so he needed John, or someone, I guess, to perform a surgery on him that he did on one of the victims that was at the 731 camp. And we didn't really see it at the end, but John did oblige. And the second story was about all of John's exes that have died. And we saw him walking through a park one night after last call, so he's all drunk. And he starts seeing all the women who have died in his life that he loved. And their spirits begin to follow him through this park. And by the end of it, we saw all their spirits gather together. And then a bright white light opened up before them, and they floated away. So I'm not sure what exactly that's implying, other than maybe they got to rest in peace. And that's what happened in the last issue. So first things first, with issue 144, we got the cover. We see John standing there smoking, like always. He's looking out at us. And behind him, we see an old man sitting on a rock in a somewhat destroyed village. And in the foreground next to John, we see some sort of insect. I'm not sure if it's a honeybee or a fly, but it is dead. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Darko Macon with art by Gary Erskine. Now, if you look this issue up, it says Warren Ellis wrote some of this too. I'm not sure if he did like the scripting of it or something, or maybe the plot, and then Darko took it from there. But I will say that this is definitely the last little story arc of the Warren Ellis run. So maybe he had the plot for this story, told it to Darko, and Darko just wrote the rest of it. But I tried to research that, and I couldn't find anything, so it's just a guess. But that's what I think happened. And I will say that kind of makes sense because this issue is a bit all over the place. I had a really hard time figuring out exactly when certain things were happening, because normally in comics, when they do past and present scenes, there's some kind of filter to indicate that this was the past or this is the present, or at least some kind of text at the top corner of each page when that happens that says past or present. But this story doesn't have any of that, so I was trying to figure out the order of, events happening, and it was very hard. I think I got it. I might have some stuff wrong, but I did the best I could, so if I got something wrong and you notice it, let me know, and I will put that correction in the show notes after I publish it. So without further ado, let's get into this. We turn to the first page, and we see John is standing in what looks like a park. He's smoking, of course, and his narration says, "I've missed so many funerals in my life. A good training for missing my own. So, of course, once I showed up, nobody else came." Then as John flicks away the ash on his cigarette, we hear someone off panel say, "John Constantine? What are you doing here?" And John looks down and he sees a young boy, and John says, "Feeling like a right git for taking a dog out for a walk and forgetting I don't have one." And the boy smiles up at him and says, "You're curious, aren't you? You want to know about my grandfather?" And John looks down at him sarcastically and says, "Right you are, mate. I make a habit of getting up in the morning to inquire about dead blokes whose names I don't even know." And the boy replies, "It's Kemal." And John looks confused and says, "Eh?" Then we turn the page and we get a panel of an old man sitting at a kitchen table, and the boy finishes saying, "His name was Kemal." So we can assume that when he says "was" right here, and they're talking about this grandfather that died, that this is the boy's grandfather when he was alive. So we are going to the past as of right now. And we see in the panel that Kemal is staring up at something, but we can't see what it is. And from the kitchen, he calls out to a woman in the next room saying, "What month is this, Azra?" And Azra, who looks like she's getting ready to go out, says, "There's a calendar in the kitchen. Why don't you look at it?" And I should say that there are brackets around their dialogue, so they are speaking a different language but I'm not sure which one, because normally when they do that, they put an asterisk and say what it is, but they didn't do that in this issue. So in response to Azra saying that Kemal should look at the kitchen, Kemal just stares straight ahead and doesn't look on the calendar next to him and says, "I never had to do that in the old country. I would look at the trees, listen to my bees, smell the grass and taste the air, and I would know the day and the hour." And as he says that last line, he stares back up at whatever he was looking at the ceiling. And Azra still hasn't stopped getting ready. She's been brushing her hair and putting on makeup. And as she looks in the mirror to put on her lipstick, she says, "Dad, you're not in the old country anymore." And Kemal says, "No, I'm not." And then Azra walks into the kitchen, buttoning up her shirt, and she says, "It's November. Why is it so important all of a sudden?" And then he turns to look at her, and we get a panel that's high above them, so we can see the ceiling. And above him is a light, and there's all these flies buzzing around it. And he says, "There shouldn't be flies in November." And we also see on this page that this issue is called Ashes and Honey Part 1. And there's also a stack of newspapers that's wrapped up. And I'm not sure if she's going to deliver these newspapers or something, but she picks them up as she's about to go, and she says, "This is London, Father. Maybe the flies are different here. Maybe they eat more of, what do they call them? Preservatives." But Kemal doesn't continue talking about that. He actually changes the subject and asks, "Where are my boots, Azra?" And Azra's kind of confused and says, "Your boots?" And Kemal answers, "I can't find them anywhere." And so Azra turns around and goes to a hall closet, and as she's about to open it, she says, "Who cares? I'll find you a new pair. You won't believe the things these people throw away." And Kemal says, "I had them for 30 years. Do you think Samir took them?" And as Azra opens the closet, she says, "Now, why would Samir take them? I bought him an almost new pair of trainers and..." But she stops as she looks down where his boots should be, and we see the new trainers that she bought Samir. So it seems that Samir did, in fact, take Grandpa Kemal's boots. Then we cut to a panel of young Samir running, and next to him is a rat that's running as well. Then we turn the page and we get a panel of him still running, but now we can see a lot more animals. He's surrounded by flies, and there's also a bird flying over his shoulder, and the bird has red on its feathers, so it looks like it's injured. So Samir reaches a gate and stops, and he says, "Huso, open up. It's me, Samir." And it seems like the gate is surrounding a mausoleum or an above-ground grave of some sort. And we see the door of it open, and a boy comes out and says, "What's the password?" And Samir answers, "Pizda," which I'm assuming is a word that they all know. So the boy lets Samir through the gates, and he asks, "How are you today, Samir?" And as Samir catches his breath, he says, "Better, thanks." And we don't see it, but we can assume that the two boys go in. Then we get a panel of John Constantine a little bit further away in the same cemetery, and he's staring at that same mausoleum that Samir and his friend went in. And as he smokes, he says, "This is it then, eh, Squire?" And then he looks down like he's talking to someone, and he says, "Not much company, are you? I've known nuns who were more fun." But he stops as we get a panel of a bulldog standing next to his leg, who's raising its leg like it's about to pee on John, and John yells out, "Oh, sod it!" But no urine comes out of the dog, and the dog looks kind of sad, and John's narration says, "Unnecessary upon reflection. The reflexes might have still been working, but dead dogs don't piss. They just go through the motions." And under this last line of narration, we cut back to the kitchen where Kemal is sitting, and we get a shot of the ceiling lamp where all the flies are buzzing around, and one of them looks like it's struggling, and we see Kemal reach out and grab it. Then Kemal, who's now by himself in the house because Azra has left, walks out of his apartment barefoot, and we see on the ground there's a bunch of broken glass and needles and cigarette butts, and the hallway of his apartment complex has a bunch of graffiti on it, so it looks like not a nice place to live. Then we follow Kemal as he walks out of the building, and it is nighttime outside, and I'm not sure if this is just behind their apartment building or if he walked elsewhere, but he meets with two men. There's a brown guy in a turban and a white guy in a heavy jacket, and as Kemal approaches, the man in the jacket says, "God be with you, Kemal. Do you have any more of that stuff?" And we see Kemal reach into his pocket and he says, Yes, here." And then he hands both men honeycomb, and the man in the turban asks, "Will it get me high?" And the man in the coat answers, "Better yet, it's going to take you home." And then both of the men take a bite of the honeycomb, And upon their first bite, each of them seem like they're transported back to their place of origin. We see the man in the turban is surrounded by greenery, and it's very beautiful, and there's a Buddha statue next to him. And the guy in the coat is transported to somewhere with lots of tall pine trees and snowy mountains, and they both look very happy. Then we cut back to Kemal, who's standing next to the men, who I guess are just kind of tripping on the honey that he gave them. And Kemal still has the fly in one of his hands. And so he puts his hands together, leaving room for the fly, and he says into his hands, "And now, little dead fly, take me to Samir." And then the fly, which I guess was dead, begins to fly away, and Kemal follows it. Then we cut back to the mausoleum, where we see two more boys approaching, and one of them has an eye patch, and the other boy who's leading the way yells out, "Pizda!" And as he does, we see John standing behind them in the bushes, kind of watching this. So we can assume he heard the code word. And the two boys are led into the mausoleum, and as they go down, the boy leading the way says, "Hello, Samir. This is Paul." And he motions to the boy with the eye patch behind him. Then we get a panel of Samir sitting on some boxes with some other boys, and he looks up and he says, "Hello, Brad. Hello, Paul. What can I do for you?" Then we see Paul, the boy with the eye patch, approach him, and he says, "It's my eye. Brad told me you could make it good again." And Samir stands up and he pulls up the eye patch to look at the empty socket, and he says, "It can be done. What did you bring me?" Then we see Paul hold up a VCR and he hands it to Samir, and he says, "I only have this at the moment, but it's a good one, and I'm strong, so if you ever need..." But Samir cuts him off saying, "I'll take the VCR, and you'll bring me another." And then he sets the VCR down on the ground, and he covers Paul's bad eye with his hand, and he says, "Stand still now." And then the room illuminates with a green light, and we can see that the light is coming off of the boots. So it seems that Samir's grandfather Kemal's boots are magical, and that's probably why Kemal was upset that Samir had taken them earlier. And Kemal begins with a spell of some kind, saying, "Prisi Moji Pamagajte, Oko Iskam, Oko Dajte." And then the green light glows a little bit brighter, and Samir's eyes roll back into his head a little bit. And then the green glow goes away, and as Samir removes his hand from Paul's face, Paul smiles and says, "It was true. I can see. I can see." And then as Paul is celebrating with another boy in there, we see Samir bend over in pain, and he spits up blood into his hand, and Brad sees this and asks him, "Are you all right, Samir?" And Samir says, "Fine, Brad, fine." Then we cut to the outside of the mausoleum, and we see John smoking and the undead bulldog just scratching himself, and John's narration says, "Once upon a time, there was a small boy who had a dog, his only friend in the whole world. That dog got hit by a car. The boy started nicking things to pay for the dog's resurrection. So far, so good. The coppers got involved. They don't buy the resurrection part, but they do call the boy's parents. The parents, by the way, had lived with the undog dead for a fortnight and not once noticed the tire marks. Same parents suddenly get upset and do their best to find the planetary authority on weird shit. Meaning, of course, me." And as John is narrating, we're getting a couple more panels of John watching something, and he's seeing two boys drag a very heavy garbage bag through the cemetery and go up to the mausoleum and say the code word, and they are let in. Then we get to the inside of the mausoleum where one of the boys says to Samir, "Here he is, Samir, the rich kid I told you about." And Samir looks at the kid and says, "Good. What do you want from me, rich boy? And what have you brought in return?" And the boy that's holding the garbage bag is the boy he's talking to. And this guy is a white kid with blonde hair, and he holds up a credit card and he says, I brought you this." And Samir takes it and looks at it and says, "A credit card? What should I do with a credit card?" And the rich boy answers, But it's platinum. It's better than money. My father always says..." But Samir throws the card back at him and then cuts him off saying, "It's good for your father, but it'll only get me arrested. A kid with a platinum card. I need money or stuff I could fence." And the rich boy just clings onto his garbage bag and says, "Please, I gave all my money and jewels to the sitter so she'd cover for me. Please, it's my sister." And then he opens up the garbage bag and we see the body of a dead girl in it. And she looks to be the same age as this boy, maybe like 10 to 13. And everybody looks in horror as they see this dead girl. And Samir says, What did you do? And the rich boy gets on his hands and knees in front of Samir, and with tears in his eyes, he begs him, saying, We were just playing the stuff we saw on TV. I didn't want her to die for real. Honest, I didn't. And then Samir gets very serious, and he says, Shut up. I'll do it. And then he kneels down next to the dead girl's body, and he holds her in his arms. Then the room illuminates with a green light, and he says, Presi emoji, Sovjoto draga, Djetiovo J Kodvraga, Jedi moji, Pomagache, Nju vam iskam, Njumi djate. And as he's saying these spell words, we are seeing all the animals that are around him, like his rat and pet bird. They are falling to the ground dead. And one of the boys says to another in the room as they watch this, His rat, dead. And the boy that he says that to shushes him. And then we cut to all the flies that were at Kemal's kitchen table, and they have fallen from the ceiling dead. And then we cut to the outside of the mausoleum where John is standing with the bulldog, and the bulldog is now lying on the ground motionless. And John says, You get in one of those moods, Squire. Want me to dig out Lassie for you? And when the dog doesn't move, John realizes something is wrong, and he says, Squire? Then we cut to Kemal, his grandfather, who last we saw was following that fly, but it has fallen from the sky down to the ground, and as Kemal looks at it, he says, No, Samir, don't. Then we cut back to the inside of the mausoleum where Samir is finishing the spell. He looks pretty ragged. He's bleeding from his nose. It seems this magic is taking its toll on him. And he continues the spell saying, Ona mije, Circe, Takala verite, JV, is pakla. Then we get two panels of the men in the story running. We see John yelling, Shit, as he runs towards the mausoleum. And we see the grandpa Kemal running, saying, Samir! And it seems John gets there first because he was there right next to the mausoleum. And as he gets to the gate, he says, Open up, kid. You don't know what you're messing with. And we see a boy come out and he says, Nobody gets in here without the password. And then John's narration says, The password? What was it? Something with piss? And then he looks at the boy and says, Piss ta. But the boy doesn't open the gate. He looks at John angrily, and in his language he says, Pizdasi sam, Pedero Ingleski. And they don't give us a translation, but we can kind of assume that means to fuck off or something like that. And after the boy yells this, John's narration says, So much for John the Polyglot. Back to basics. And then he puts on a big smile and he says, Oh, I've got it. Green Mamba. And he says that like he's just remembered it's the real password. And the boy looks at him and says, Green Mamba? That's no password. And then John says, Perhaps not, but I call him as I see him. And then the boy looks down horrified as a snake bursts from his pants. And he begins to jump around wildly as he takes his pants off and gets butt naked. And he's yelling, Get it off! Get it off! And it doesn't look like there's a snake in his pants. It looks like John turned the kid's dick into a snake. But I don't think he did that in actuality. I think it's just him making the boy think that that's what happened. Because as the boy falls down to the ground, it disappears. And John says, Cheers, mate, and walks past him. Then we cut to inside where Samir looks really bad now. Like his teeth are falling out of his mouth and he just looks like he's struggling. And his words are also stuttered like that. But we do see the girl's eyes are open. So it seems his magic is working. And he's saying, Puno, Bulgy, Sam, Odd, Smirty, Nico, Mene, Nitko, Sturty. But John walks in and interrupts him saying, The kindergarten's closed, boys and girls. Uncle John's here and ugh! And he's cut off as one of the children in the room took a stick and hits him in the stomach. And as John falls to the ground, they all grab around him and hold him down. And just as it looks like John's about to get beat by a bunch of children, we see Kemal run into the room and say, Samir, don't! And Samir looks up from the girl and says, Grandfather? And the girl in his arms looks over towards the grandfather too. And her brother sees that and he says, She's alive! Lizzie! And as Samir cradles her, he says to his grandfather, I did it! Look, grandfather, I can do it! And then Kemal walks to his grandson and says, No, Samir, you don't understand. It's wrong. You can't just wake the dead. There's a price. There's always a price. Take off the boots, Samir. And I should mention that just because the girl can move her eyes to look at the grandpa, her whole body is still limp. So it seems Samir wasn't fully done with the spell. So he holds onto her tightly and brings her up to his chest, and he says, I can do it. I can bring her back. And now I'll bring father back too. And Samir looks at his grandson and says, listen to me, Samir, will you? And Samir looks at him with anger in his eyes and says, why should I? You did nothing to help him. And then the rich boy cuts in and says, what about my sister? Why did you stop? And I should say that all this conversation between Samir and his grandfather is in whatever language they speak. So the rich kid and John don't understand any of this. So John is just watching this as the kids hold him down, and his narration says, can't stand foreign movies personally, but I wouldn't say no to some subtitles right now. And we see one of the other kids in the room put his hand over the rich kid's mouth and hold him still. And Kemal and his grandson don't really register what was said to them. They just keep talking, and Kemal says, there was nothing I could do. Your father's dead, Samir. And Samir says, I'll bring him back to life. You'll see. I've been practicing, and I'm earning money for the fair home. And then Kemal bends down and picks up the dead bird and rat and holds them out to Samir and says, do you call this life? And now Samir begins to cry, and he says, I have to bring him back. I owe him. He. And we turn the page and we get a panel of what happened to his dad. And it looks like there's some kind of war-torn city. And as Samir and his father are running through it, it looks like his dad is part of the military force that's defending the city, I'm assuming. And his head is exploding. So it looks like he was killed in action trying to protect Samir. Then we come back to the mausoleum and we see Kemal is holding his grandson's head in his hands. And he says, I know what he did. The right thing. Parents give their lives for their children, not the other way around. Your father's dead, Samir. Then we get a panel of Samir's eyes open very wide, and it seems like he accepts what his grandfather just told him. And then he looks down at the girl in his arms and he says, I promised to bring her back. And then Kemal kisses Samir's head and he says, I know. I never asked for much. So help me now. You know what I ask for. You know what I offer. And then he grabs onto both Samir and the dead girl's body, which all the life has seemingly gone out of now. It seems like Kemal is holding on to both of them very tight because Samir tries to protest, saying, Grandfather, no! And as Kemal holds Samir and the girl's head into his chest, he says, please! And then some sort of magic happens. We don't really see exactly what happens, but the grandfather falls down dead, and Samir yells out, Grandfather! Grandfather! And then the rich kid rushes over to his sister's body, and he picks her up in his arms, and then we hear the girl say, Richie? And it looks like maybe all the other kids in the room have cleared out because John is not surrounded by children anymore. He is just standing and watching. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue, so we'll have to wait until next week to see what happens. But until then, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, @gmail.com. We will see you on the next one.